Archetypal Tarot podcast explores universal human patterns, called archetypes, by investigating the major arcana of the ancient tarot. We recognize these archetypes because they are present in our own life stories, myths, and culture. Each card represents a stage of the journey for understanding the greater story of our lives.
Hello, I am Julienne, and I'm here with my collaborator, Cyndera, and today's Archetypal Tarot podcast is all about lunacy, creativity, and dreams, which are found in the darker places of our psyche, and is represented by the card 18 of the Major Arcana, the Moon. We're also going to discuss the archetype of the artist and its relationship to this particular stage of the journey. So, hey there, Cyndera.
Hello, Julienne.
Hello.
Are you feeling sufficiently mad enough for this card today?
Am I a lunatic? Is that what you're asking? It's been said.
No, I was just asking for today, not a lifelong trend, just for today.
I'm gonna cop to both.
Well, you started out that podcast very professionally and very nicely. So
I know, it's kind of wrong for this card, right? I should have been like, we're gonna talk about maybe moaning about something anyway. Oh, I think we just busted everyone's eardrums.
All right, sorry about that if you had your volume down, but you really should turn that down. You know, keep the earbuds going.
Just listen close, as we normally do. We can talk about these characters. What is it? What's on this card that we can talk about symbolically?
Yeah, what is going on here? So we've got the moon right up there in the sky with a face in it, rather reminiscent of the Fool, his little face up there. And I'm looking at the Marseille's version right now, which isn't that different from the Rider-Waite, so we're just going to stick to these major symbols of these old decks today. And howling at the moon, or barking or yapping at the moon, we have two dogs looking up in this nighttime sky, and then below them we have, emerging from this pool of water, like something from a dream, a lobster or a crawfish, crayfish, a very ancient creature from the sea rising up. In the background we have a couple of plants sprouting up between the dogs, and towers, a golden city, a place of promise, it seems, in the background. So what do we make of these very bizarre symbols? Where did we come from? How did we get here?
That's exactly my point. Okay, so we just left the stage of the star, right? So this is beautiful woman by a pool in the water, and she's pouring water on the ground, and the stars are in the sky, and you know, prior to that we were knocked on our you-know-what. Then the stars, you know, about finding your true north, your true desire. You've had so much stripped away from you that you've gotten at that true desire, and it's this kind of idyllic setting in the evening with the stars, and then you walk onto this scene and what the hell? I'm sorry, but WTF. It was all pretty, you know, star in sight, and then you think the moon, it'll be beautiful, and you know, another gorgeous nighttime scene, but you've got madness here. You've got these dogs yapping, you've got this crazy freaking like lobster coming up out of the water. I'm sorry. I looked at this, I'm like, what the hell is happening? It's nuts. And then, you know, you look deeper and you're like, yeah, it is. It is a lot to do with a madness. And, you know, like what is happening here? The symbols, for me, the dogs and it's written that it's a dog and a wolf. That kind of makes sense to me. They're wild beasts. And the dog is the domesticated, you know, symbol of loyalty, and the wolf is that wildness, that absolute just howling at the moon. And they both appear to be howling at the moon. They both appear to be responding not from the intellect, not even from emotion, but from instinct. And then, you know, don't ask me about that freaking lobster thing there. It's nutty. We've not seen anything like it in any of the cards. And to me, you know, as the symbologist type person, we saw a lot of water in the last card. It was calm. It was in the foreground, and it's still in the foreground, and this creature's coming up out of it. It's very dreamlike. It's very weird. Sure, you can attach a lot of symbols to it, but I think the fact that it is so incongruous is important. I'll just take the fact that, like, what the hell's this?
Yeah, and this is the first card in the linear journey of the Major Arcana where we don't have a human figure in it. So that's really fascinating, and it adds to that dreamlike quality. And and you mentioned that one is a wolf, one is a dog. So we've reached a place of not being too wild or being too domesticated, or maybe the two are battling it out in this card.
Yeah.
It does have there's a conflictual, that there's something being worked out here.
The point out too, symbolically, the moon, right? You think of the goddess Diana, or Artemis or Artemis, and the relationship of, she had dogs, the symbols of those dogs. And I know, Cyndera, you and I were talking about what is the importance of this relationship of the moon, the goddess Diana, and those dogs.
Yeah, and we've been talking about how, even though we've been taking these podcasts on the Major Arcana in a linear fashion, it's as if we're circling around back to these things. Why are we here again? Why are we in the darkness? Why is there this struggle? And it's as if we have returned around perhaps to that goddess Diana, the High Priestess card, as you remember.
Yeah.
She was connected with the moon, and here we are in the light of the moon, or in the shadow of this goddess. And the moon goddess Diana had these dogs, and there's a famous myth about her, Artemis is her other name, of ripping to shreds a man who had glimpsed her naked in the wilderness, and she leashed the dogs upon him because this was so secret, no one could see her secret life. No one could witness and stay alive. And so it's as if we're coming across something very, very private and secret and a little bit forbidden in this card. And something also new is just emerging that was before veiled. It's like we're behind the veil now.
Exactly.
We're behind the priestess's veil. And the water, you can see it as a symbol of the unconscious, and something very ancient, very old is coming up out of the waters, represented by this lobster.
Lobster, crawfish.
Very ancient creature. And if this creature, I believe, if I can get my biological facts straight, if this creature isn't killed by a predator or something, it just continues to grow.
They do, yeah.
It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's just rising up out of the water here.
So it is kind of it's a sea monster coming up out of it. And I think the image that I think is helpful for me to kind of go back to this, what is this stage, right? We have, if the focal point of the last stage was to have us really get what our true desire and our true north is. This to me is the first challenge, because you're coming upon something that's kind of crazy. It's confusing. It is, as we're looking at the symbols here about unconscious things. Again, unconscious meaning where we don't have control over them. And it's that really kind of looking at it as, this isn't just a next stage after the last one, it's a circling back. If you imagine sort of our path is truly more of a spiral, what we have come up to across from us is that High Priestess. And that stage, if you look back to that, what did you learn with that stage? What were your expectations? We're seeing the same symbols that we did in the High Priestess cards. She had sort of like the two columns, the black and the white one. Well, where we are is we've actually gone between those two columns. We've gone the other side of the veil, and we're in this place where things aren't necessarily going to make sense. And what we're seeing is this instinctual nature. Where are our instincts here? And there's symbols of madness and lunacy. And to me, it kind of addresses the modern person's reliance on our intellect, and that how are we making our decisions, and is it going to be rational? The moon, the ideas here are definitely making the point that things aren't always rational, and rational and irrational is not bad, but it is dangerous, and we're gonna see it as dangerous because you can lose control.
Yeah, and so by the light of the moon, when all else is darkness, just things look differently. They take on different shapes, and we see the world in different forms. And I'm just reminded now of the moon being in touch with women's cycles and so forth. And I don't often share these TMI moments, little personal moment here,
It's just
but
between us. No one else is
yeah,
listening.
me and Julienne and the world. No, just kidding. Um, that's the last card. We'll get to that later. But in honor of the moon card here, just the other night, I feel like it's relevant. I was just suddenly overwhelmed or overcome in the middle of the night, early in the morning, and usually I sleep like a log. But it was the new moon. I didn't even know it was the new moon, but I started to get all of these really intense feelings, feeling overwhelmed, like, and beginning to mourn things like the ecological situation and where we're all going as human beings and what it means to be on this planet. All of these things were just overwhelming me, and then I had to get up out of bed and check where the moon was, and it was sure enough new moon in 1 hour. And I felt like, oh my gosh, the moon is dying. It feels like the moon is dying, and at the same time, of course, I'm starting my period. Right? That egg, right, is going away. It will never be a child sort of feeling. And I had to think to myself, am I going mad in these moments? Like when we're in this part of our phase, are we mad momentarily, or is this veil lifted for a little while and we are able to do the necessary work of seeing and mourning and experiencing what's happening on a deeper level? And that was this big question that came to me at this time, because usually I'm able to quite cheerfully go through life and just get on with it, but it was in moments like in these when I had no preparation or control over it that I just sink down into a sort of mad moment. But it seems as though there's something important there too.
Yeah, and I would bet honestly that there were a lot of nodding heads listening to what you were talking about. I think especially with this last moon, but and there is, I believe it was Libra and Aries. So we have the peacemaker, we have the judge peacemaker with the warrior happening symbolically, and I can't speak to deeply into the astrological realm of it, but I too absolutely this last new moon and with a lot of full moons do feel that you're drawn into very, very, very strong emotions, which if you just sit in judgment on the outside can be considered crazy. But I think you make a
Mm-hmm.
really, really good point that being drawn into sort of the pure sense of these emotions, and not the trick is to not necessarily make a bunch of decisions from them, but to be with them experientially, to make space for them to be there,
Mm-hmm.
but to not look at them as marching orders for any way, shape, or form. That's, I think, the beauty of looking at the story that the Major Arcana has for us is that we have been, if we look at the spiral of what we've learned, and the bottom of that spiral is those first, say, 8 or 10, where we're being taught lessons and we're being brought into the bosom or brought into the strength of the wisdom of each of those characters, that we're now much more ready to face these things. And in terms of these emotions and this lunacy and the moon card, a lot of people associate with unrealistic ideas of like dreaming and just being not in touch with reality. But the high priestess is there to make space for this bit of lunacy, to make space for this dreaming, and to not just sort of push it out as craziness. But at the same time, there's nothing here that says, go in here and make a bunch of decisions based on this madness that you're going to go through,
Right.
or this set of symbols and illusions. But to absolutely, it presents it as something to be worked with and to give space.
And that takes us right back to the high priestess's wisdom, which was being able to be with and just be, and she's sitting down, she's not an action figure.
She
She's
and she wasn't the mother loving figure either. There
mm-hmm,
wasn't
mm-hmm.
there was the high priestess is not indulgent in a overly emotional way, but it's a holding steady and a presence. It's not like, oh yeah, go work with this insane idea and go actually do it. I mean, that decision might happen, and I think that's where for me anyway, I look at this card and I wanted to talk about the artist. because a lot of the nature of what's happening in this stage or the story here has a lot to do with what artists and creativity have to go through.
Ooh,
So,
wonderful
don't you
artist.
think?
Tell us all about that archetype of the artist.
Yeah, I know this one real well. In terms of sort of how people claim or are claimed by an archetype. Yeah, I'm pretty foursquare in the middle of this, and I would say you are as well. Cyndera, being deeply creative people. Everyone's creative, but there is certainly something about the artist that is distinct. It is its own sort of template or shape of the psyche with a lot of things in it, and it's easy. I mean, it's a popular archetype. You say artist, and people get an image in their mind, for better or for worse. So I mean, I don't want to go spend too much time talking about what is an artist. I think most of us know. What I do want to make sure that I do is make sure that the scope is seen as people who are passionate about expressing a dimension of life that is beyond the obvious and beyond the senses. So there is something about creating and transcendence in the nature of the artist, and it has so much to do with not just what they make, but their own intensity and their motivation to manifest something that's extraordinary, or that they alone were put in the world to create. And that could be somebody who is creative in a kitchen, who's an artist in a kitchen. There's people who are just craftspeople, but their motivation, their passion is to create. That's something that is extraordinary or is transcendent of the everyday. So it's a big category. It does include all the offshoots of, I would throw in a chef, craftsperson, actors, dancers, musicians. Artist is sort of the big category.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're talking about today in this sort of creative madness, this lunacy, I think artists go through to one degree or another, because artists are typically expressing what's happening from within to without.
Mm-hmm.
And people like directors and screenwriters are all artists themselves. We have a glut of films and books and art that is about this very thing, it makes it much easier for us to explore. And if you're not, if you don't identify with the artist archetype, and some of that is foreign to you, we look at this stage as everybody will go through it in one form or another. I think it's just sort of the bailiwick of the artist. They probably own more real estate in this land, as it were. And there's a lot to do, I think, that maybe not an art classically seen as an artist, but someone like Carl Jung was definitely involved in this stage, wrote about it, and wrote about it in a way that it wasn't just, I'm an artist, I'm going through this. He was more of an alchemist or philosopher, technician of the psyche. So,
And he goes so great with the moon card, and with and many of you may have heard the release of his very, very private, amazing book. The Red Book came out a couple of years now,
it
I
was
think.
his journal.
Yeah, it was his private
He didn't
journal.
write it to be published.
Yeah, he didn't write it to be published, though I think he probably suspected that it might become public at some point. And it is gorgeous. It is just absolutely beautiful. And he credits it to be the basis of much of his major works later in his life. And it's just full of calligraphy and paintings that he made, though he did decline the title of artist. He felt like it was his own, personal journey, and he didn't want to get it all tied up with the artist label.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's an archetype that he wrestled with.
Yeah,
he really want to own it that way.
What he experienced was that he had like the anima voice. His inner feminine essentially was saying, "This is art, this is art," and he would deny it, and he didn't want to be tempted by that.
The masculine, the animus. It's like, no, you can't be an artist.
He was very firm on not calling it art, but being a personal exploration, very, very deep. Yeah. But I think it would be very relevant to our card, and it's a huge book here. That's all I have to.
We have a copy of it sitting here, and I don't know if anyone's ever seen the Red Book in person. You probably won't find it at a library, because at least the first editions they put out, it's huge. It's what, 20, 20 inches, 20 some odd inches by, I don't know. It's most of your arm.
Yeah.
I joke about it. I love this book. It's gorgeous. But you could basically just put like legs on it and it could be a table. But it needs to be, I think, if you have a friend who has a copy, or you have a copy, or you can get your hands on it, and you're looking at, what is this stage of the moon about? Flipping through this book, I think, could be helpful. And knowing that Jung himself, this is his journey. This is his journal and his journey and his descent into madness.
And the reason it was held back for so long by his family was that they feared that he would be viewed as mad because of what's in this book, and that it would demean or dethrone his work that he did over a lifetime. But I think for many, they've released it, I think, at a great time. I think many people are drawing fresh inspiration from it.
What, 2008?
Yeah, something like that.
They put it out just as that sort of the economic things were starting to get ugly. There were some major things happening, and this came out at a really interesting time.
Yeah, it is interesting you say that, because when there's recession, when people maybe even unemployed or have more time on their hands, they have to turn in and they have to reflect, and this is like a guide, not for you to he didn't want you to copy him, but to find your own way, your own relationship with the moon, or with these unseen parts of yourself. So I'm going to read a statement he made in 1957, towards the end of his life, about the Red Book. The years of which I have spoken to you when I pursued the inner images were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. It began at that time, and the later details hardly matter anymore. My entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me. That was the stuff and material for more than only one life. Everything later was merely the outer classification, the scientific elaboration, and the integration into life. But the numinous beginning, which contained everything, was then.
That really, really, I think, speaks to, it just goes against what we are taught in our waking world and in the culture of, it's all about physically making something. You've got to have an accomplishment. You've got to do something. You've got to be able to make it and show it to the world, which is true. But I think our focus is always, it tends to always be on that. What this card is saying is there's a lot of stuff in here. There's a lot of stuff in your psyche that is going to seem crazy and it's going to seem mad, and that it might or might not have anything to do with what you create in the world, but it is really, really important. It's that intangible reminder
invisible.
It's invisible, but it is equally important. And so
it is.
This stage, or this sense that, like, oh my God, I just need to go to a therapist and get over all of this. I think what Jung is saying, and what we're saying too, is maybe this isn't to be gotten rid of. This isn't just a pathology.
This is the path. This is the way. And the crawfish or the lobster is rising up right now in my mind. and I think it also has something to teach as a symbol, which is that it's flesh. It has an exoskeleton. It's hard on the outside. It's useful on the outside. It's protected on the outside. But inside of it is all the soft, vulnerable flesh.
Tasty lemon butter. What?
And Julienne's getting hungry. But I think there's something to be learned from that, is that we must have the space. We must protect these parts that seem useless or vulnerable, but they are the substance within us. And yeah, that's incredible. And it's in this Red Book, and it's in you, in whatever form, path that you take. This stuff can well up.
Yeah, it's real. And I think it's pretty easy to romanticize this stage or what have you. It's pretty easy to just to put it into a film or whatever and go, oh, that happens to other people. That is not relevant to me. It was a pretty film or whatever. But I think we all know at that deeper level there is something there. And I think anybody listening to this podcast who's drawn to kind of these ideas can probably relate to it a little bit more. We're talking about deep shadow stuff. Deep shadow stuff. Shadow meaning, unexamined. This is an invitation to be with it, to make space for it, and to a degree examine, I think, but not in that clinical, I'm going to be separated and just examine it. It is experiential. And this sort of invitation to be beyond the veil, and I think the choices that are brought up are really important, and I think that's something we should talk about in terms of to put this into the context of a couple of choices when we're in this, brought to this place of there's so much, whatever your own particular brand of lunacy, these very deep emotional, you're worried, you've got a lot of imagination, there's a fantasy coming up, there's just lots of psychological sort of like potential conflict happening. Do you run away from it? Do you go through it? I think this choice is pointing out, or this card is pointing out, do you go mad with it? Do you become one of those dogs barking at the moon? Or do you navigate it in such a way that you're with it? You're finding out where it can take you.
And I think a great model for this, as we begin to get towards the media portion of our podcast, is the eternal sunshine of the spotless mind.
Yeah.
And we see the main character, Jim Carrey's character, go through this, after the painful end of this very deep relationship with the Kate Winslet character. He wants to have it all erased. He doesn't want to deal with the madness and pain that he feels from it. And of course, what is the consequence when one does not face this madness? And what's the definition of madness? It's
doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Exactly. Yeah. And so he inevitably falls in love with her once again, and this is a wonderful symbol for what happens in real life all the time when we don't work through our parental projections. What causes us to fall in love with the same person over and over again. We will fall in love with maybe not the same literal person again and again, but the same kind of person again and again.
Same shades of the archetypes. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it after a while it begins to feel like a madness. Like, God, this is so familiar. The same thing happens every time. But that feeling of madness, or that repetition, that spiraling back around, is what will instigate the healing, or instigate something has to change. I need to get out of this dark night of the soul that I keep revisiting.
Yeah, that's a good point too. That this card is many people do consider the dark night of the soul. The really
Sally Nichols, Archetypal Tarot. If you haven't checked it out yet, check it out.
That is good.
Jung and Tarot. Sorry, that's her book.
Jung and Tarot. But to kind of get back to the themes of what's brought up in the Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and I think it's fascinating because the same director, to kind of bring in the artist here, the same director, Michel Gondry, also made a movie called The Science of Sleep. And I think it's, for me, you can kind of take a look at what the choices are. They're kind of brought up in here is to work with that sort of those deeply strong emotions, and in Eternal Sunshine, his first choice is the typical modern Western choice of get rid of it. And so many people, if you had that service today, and actually just heard something on NPR podcast Radio Lab about, can you just take these memories out of me, and how they're actually working on it. But that's that's what we will do. We will, choose, oh yeah, it's going to be easy. Take it out. Take this painful experience away. And what, Jungian psychology, and certainly, we're talking about in this stage, is like, you are not you without that experience with it. So it's there. It's difficult. Ain't nobody saying this is going to be easy, but it's there to work with, and not always in the, you got to go in there and tackle it.
Right.
And this stage isn't all about making a lot of sense. It's about making room for things to not necessarily make sense. But again, the analog here is the High Priestess, that wisdom, what we learned there, and then from the subsequent journey on this spiral, having that with us in this place of madness and not running away from it and not trying to take it out, will let us potentially actually not only heal it, include it, but work with it and possibly enjoy it. And that relates to the other film that Michel Gondry made, The Science of Sleep, which is it's sad, but it's beautiful. It is very fantastical, but it is kind of working with a lot of similar themes in a different way, because that emotional space is bigger. That it's as if you have conflicts, but there's enough room for them to happen. You don't exacerbate them by telling that story over and over again. You live the story instead of just tell the story, and work with it that way. Those are two films I recommend if people enjoy that type of film. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and The Science of Sleep, both directed by Michel Gondry. Just to circle back a little bit more with the artist, and I don't know that I touched on this yet. The tortured artist is a flavor of the artist, and we can certainly see with the moon the tortured artist. You know, we've mentioned the film Frida here before, and the artist Frida. That's certainly something to look at, and it has really become, that tortured artist has become sort of synonymous, and I think it's because of this stage, because there is this storm of apprehension and anxiety and illusion and delusion happening, and it's the artist that can show this stage really well. It is as if this is sort of our natural place to be, and the conflicts and how you go through that. So, you know, I have a list as long as my arm of films and books that are about this very same thing, that are about essentially what we're presenting here in the moon. Not all, unfortunately, most of them are tragic. You know, you've got The Bell Jar, you've got Sylvia Plath, certainly Philip K. Dick's books, especially Valis, is represented here in terms of that sort of like creative madness stage. One that I just rewatched recently, which I thought was a good example, was The Hours, based on Virginia Woolf and the book Mrs. Dalloway, and it's three intertwining stories taking place in, you know, it was at the 20s and you know, early 2000s and then the 50s. So I see that, and in particular more of a feminine way of working with this sort of going to these places. It has to do with, you know, a suicide, and that to me is that giving up, that like you've descended into that madness and not found your way out, or not opened yourself up to be with it in a way. You spent far too much time trying to get rid of the madness, and not, you know, and I think in terms of Virginia Woolf, as it's presented in this film, of she did work with the madness, but she wrestled with it, and in the end did end up ending her own life through it. I think very intelligently, but very tragically too, because it was as if, and many artists think this, is that they have to be mad in order to create. They have to be tortured in order to create. I don't believe that's true. I believe that it's easier at certain times in your life to create when you have that madness, and that is because in some way, shape, or form, you're harnessing that lunacy, that everything, that deep, deep emotion to work with it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only way that you can create. It's as if it's a drug and you've relied on that torture to create great work. But there is definitely, speaking as an artist, and I know a lot of other artists feel this way, that you can use that madness as a fuel, but you that can't be your only fuel for creativity.
What does Shakespeare say, that lovers, lunatics, and artists are an intellect all alike? And I think that it can also be compared to a quote I've heard about a mad person compared to a shaman, which is, it's the same stuff. It's the same, you know, the hallucinations they're receiving they're from the same place. They're from the unconscious. But for the mad person, they're drowning in it, and you know, their fragile vessel, their body, their mind will not be able to return. Whereas the shaman, they're swimming through these same waters. And I think that a similar thing could be said about an artist that's going to stick around with us for a while. Yeah. I think throughout, you know, look at all of the, you know, so many of the musicians throughout the 60s. Some of them were able to make it through and be successful artists into their later years, while others were consumed, you know, by the same stuff and were not able to last. So yeah, I think that that's an important point.
And that's the danger here in this stage, and that's the danger with the artist, is being consumed by it and not having any anchor points, and really looking at this whole journey that we've been on and seeing it as a spiral, and remembering that we have, and I truly believe this, we have been brought to different stages in these archetypal journeys to bring with us that knowledge and everything with us. So those can be there with us as we go into these stages. You know, we didn't just wake up and find ourselves here the first day we were born. There were a lot of other experience that I think we can call upon, and that you can look through these archetypal lenses to go back through your own life and, you know, bring that with you. And if you haven't consciously done it, I think what we are talking about gives you that opportunity to kind of go back and see where those characters were, and make space for them. And, you know, having that with you in these, I think, various trying stages. And this one, because you can feel very alone in it, is one where those archetypal characters can be very helpful. And, you know, not all artists are, all artists, I think, are can be very afraid of this stage, and you know, having a lot of apprehension. But not all of us are relying on that for creativity. And something that I would point out to people who are interested, there's a great TED Talk by Elizabeth Gilbert that talks about kind of the block, and sort of like that can make you crazy too, of thinking, oh my God, I just did something amazing, what do I do next? And I think that you know, it's highly relatable TED Talk. I'll put it in the show notes, along with, I kid you not, a list as long as my arm about creative madness and the way different artists have portrayed it, either based on true stories, you know, like Basquiat, or some others, Vincent van Gogh, and as well as some great articles that I found about this particular topic that hopefully people will find helpful. So stay to the end of the show, and in the very end, I'll list the URL to find that information.
Wonderful.
And,
so
yeah.
Raise up that crawfish as your new power animal.
Get out a pot and some lemon and some butter.
Stop trying to boil my symbol alive.
I just like
they
lobster.
feel it, I swear.
She's vegetarian. But so, and in just wrapping up, I just wanted to say, you know, please, if you want to email us, atpodcast@archetypist.com. You can reach me through my website, archetypist.com, and Cyndera's Tarot Dreamstone on Facebook. So find her on Facebook. And you know what, we're getting so many great emails from people, and
yeah, keep them coming. We love
you
it.
know, slippers, you know, things like that. Anyway, we love hearing from you, and we are incorporating your questions and things into the podcast as we can. And we only have, what, 4 left? 3
oh
left?
Yeah, we're reaching the home stretch.
We're reaching the home stretch, and really thinking about what our next steps are. And everyone who's emailed us with your suggestions, we appreciate it, and we're gonna be thinking about that. So, you know, stay tuned for that. And before this incarnation of Archetypal Tarot is over with, we will definitely give our listeners a place to land while we're not doing the podcast. So
yeah, absolutely. And so the moon card, we saw lots of twin double themes starting to emerge. We saw 2 dogs, we saw 2 plants, we saw 2 towers. So something is definitely emerging from the unconscious, which will culminate and really be our symbol that we explore next time with the twins in the sun card.
Yes,
very much looking forward to that, and hope to see you here.
Thanks so much. Bye. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to become a part of the Archetypal Tarot team by becoming one of our patrons. Our patrons are awesome. So if you're interested, visit tiny.cc/tarot for more information and the awesome rewards for joining. That's tiny.cc/tarot. Thanks for listening to the Archetypal Tarot podcast. For more in-depth information on what we talked about in the show today, just go to archetypist.com. That's archetypist.com, and just type the words "the moon" into the search bar, and you will be led to the article about today's show. Until next time, thanks so much. Bye-bye.